I'm delighted to be here. I was thinking that a conversation of this sort is like the best that occurred at the University of Calgary during my time there. And then I thought maybe that's not a very good thing to say about Conrad. I think we're perhaps on a different level. I'd like to begin with the book that you have today, and a matter of principle. And Conrad, just to begin, to get your reflections on the American judicial system, and to sort of to quote briefly from the book. You use some pretty strong language. In fact, the book makes for a pretty depressing read in terms of this. You argue that the plea bargain is an evil and profoundly corrupt process that is not reconcilable with American notions of law. You say the law of the United States is not only an ass, it is an ass spavined beyond recognition. You say, and I love this, Americans seldom reflect on how the legal system of Madison, Jefferson, and Lincoln permeated into this giant cesspool of officious legal hypocrisy. Now, these quotes are not taken out of context. When you read them in context, they're even more depressing and more damning in many ways. But I wonder if you could take a bit of time now to sort of let us know what you really think. You don't have to be polite.
That was permutated, not permeated. I mean, I only say that because you started out saying that you felt like you were back as a professor dealing with, I assume, one of your more talented students.
They were all.
Look, I agree it's a depressing read, but let me tell you, it was no day at the beach to go through it. Look, I won't be polemical and I won't engage in hyperbole. I just give you some facts. And these would be facts that many of you would be familiar with anyway. But there are in the United States 48 million people with a criminal record. I accept that about 20 million, perhaps as many as 20, are relatively inoffensive, or at least unstigmatizing things like driving under the influence 20 years ago, or disorderly at a fraternity party or something 20 years ago. Not the sort of thing that would influence a person's ability to get a job or something like that. And indeed, the former president, George W. Bush, was narrowly elected, despite the revelation in the last week of the campaign that he had had a driving under the influence conviction. But he then became a teetotaler and hadn't had a drink in 15 years. But even at that, does anyone seriously believe that there are 28 or 30 million real criminals in the U.S., 10% of the population, a substantially larger percent of the adult population? This is nonsense. All sorts of people are wrongly convicted. 99.5% of criminal prosecutions in the United States lead to convictions, compared to about 62% in Canada and about 51% in the United Kingdom. Does that mean their prosecutors are better? Of course not. Does it mean that Canada and Britain don't care about crime? Of course not. It means that the system doesn't work, or at least it works too well from a prosecutorial standpoint. And of those 99.5%, 97% are without a trial. Now that is the basis of my statement that Roger read about the plea bargain. Roger, if you were an American and some prosecutor took against you, he'd devise 190 counts to throw at you. I mean, essentially jaywalking 190 times. And then he would go around to the 10 closest friends or associates of yours in the activity objected to and say, now, I'm sure, knowing Dr. Gibbins as you do, you have evidence to corroborate this series of offenses that he committed. Your friends would say, no, I have no evidence of that, and I don't believe Roger would do that. He's an honest man. He wouldn't jaywalk. And then they'd say, well, look, we believe that he did. We're going to prosecute him, and the issue is whether we're prosecuting him or a conspiracy. So you better jog your memory or you're part of the conspiracy. They all roll over like poodles. And this is what happens. And everybody goes down. 97% of them just don't have their day in court because the way the system works, you have 4 times as heavy a sentence if you actually try the case than if you plead guilty. The whole basis of the criminal defense system is a fraud. The criminal bar is a bunch of roués who spend their time around the criminal courts with clients who are sort of Damon Runyon hoods and thugs. They never have an innocent client, and they wouldn't recognize one if they saw one. We had a few of those amongst my co-defendants, but we had some more serious lawyers too. And they're just a fig leaf for the system. And the public defenders, and what they do is they any resources you have, any money you have, any asset, they seize it by getting the FBI to file a false affidavit to a magistrate, ex parte. You get no notice of it, saying these are ill-gotten gains. The magistrate says, well, we have probable cause to believe they may be, so we will freeze the assets. Then they take the criminal proceeding, which stays the civil proceeding, so you've got no money to defend yourself with. Now, a lot of my assets were outside the U.S., and I'm very proud, and they say this, of both the British and the Canadians. When the American prosecutors showed up and said, we want you to freeze Mr. Black's assets, they said, oh, well, look, if you want to freeze his assets, I mean, we've got lots of lawyers here. They would all be honored to have the U.S. Embassy as a client. You just go ahead and try it, but it's not going to fly. But if you think we're freezing his assets on the basis of the legal assistance treaties, you're out of your mind. Take a stroll, pal. You're not getting it. And by the way, if you go to court to get it, you won't get it there either. But that's what happens in the U.S. So you've got no money to fight with. And that's how the system works. And it has gone on like this and got steadily worse for years. And where is our great crusading media? Instead of them lifting the rock on this outrage, we get Nancy Grace, who before someone is even charged says, why is Mr. X still walking the streets? We know he's guilty. The man hasn't been charged yet. Nobody says anything. It's all in the interests of freedom of expression. I'll just leave you with this thought. I mean, leave you on this question with this thought. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, 25% of its incarcerated people, and 50% of its lawyers. The lawyers take 10% of GDP, $1.6 trillion. That is far more than is necessary. Of course we have to have a society of laws, and of course we need a legal profession, an independent judiciary, and so forth, but not that costs 10% of GDP. It's a taxation on the country, and it's a persecution of the country. I had hoped that in the year when they took down the vice president of the U.S. as chief of staff, my friend Scooter Libby, who no more was guilty than anyone in this room, and took down the 5-term U.S. Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, and the prosecution subsequently proved to be fraudulent, but after he lost his election, that somebody would realize in the U.S. government, like Fouché, when Robespierre tried to execute him during the Reign of Terror, Committee of Public Safety, that it was time to execute the Committee of Public Safety instead and control the prosecutors, but it hasn't happened. And I do conclude on this. I mean, Roger, you opened a spigot with this. But
Well,
I just want to say one more thing. The Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendment guarantees of due process, no seizure of property without just compensation, access to counsel of choice, grand jury is an assurance against capricious prosecution, prompt justice, an impartial jury, and reasonable bail are rubbish. They don't exist, and I didn't get any of them. I posted $38 million. I paid legal fees of over $30 million. Now, we got rid of all the counts, finally, and then the Supreme Court, after excoriating a lower court judge, remanded back to him the assessment of the gravity of his own errors, and he spuriously retrieved 2 counts, and I'd go through the rest of my life officially as a felon in the U.S. That is not what Madison and the boys had in mind. I subside with reluctance.
well, much as I'm tempted to turn off the spigot, I want to pursue a couple more points. In the popular culture, and here I'm referring to Law and Order on TV and whatever, the reason that plea bargaining is so prevalent in the U.S. is because of the the specter of the penal system in the United States. This is the club that's used on people. In your book, your assessments of the penal system seem to be quite mild, even generous, compared to the assessments of the judicial system prior to that point. Is that a fair enough?
The penal system, you mean the custodial system?
Yeah.
What kind of treatment you get when you're a guest of the American people?
I thought for a writer, it was a great opportunity, actually.
It was. It was. You see, you have access to emails, not the internet, but emails. So I was able to. The one good point of the last decade was that my career as a writer flourished, which is indeed in some measure why we're here. But I got up to over 4 million readers writing from there, and I got a tremendous traffic of emails from readers all over the world. And so psychologically, I wasn't in the place. But in answer to your question, or not entirely in it anyway, even the prosecutors I had, they were a disgrace. They would be disbarred in this country in 5 minutes, and in Britain, and indeed even in some parts of the U.S. But I don't think disbarment is a recourse in Chicago or ever has been. But even those prosecutors weren't trying to send me to a maximum security place, so I went to, by their standards, pretty good prisons, low security prisons. I wasn't eligible for minimum security because I'm not a U.S. citizen, but nobody bothered me. I have to say that there were very few people there with a history of violent crime. There was very little violence. You get pettifogging. You've got, the correctional officers are unskilled labor, and they're not competent. They don't do anything. The inmates do all the work, such as there is any. But they didn't. I mean, some of them were kind of malicious, but nobody bothered me. But I didn't offend them. I made no effort to be friendly. I did nothing that would legitimize the mockery of the process that I'd gone through. But I did nothing to offend them, and they did not bother me. So, to that extent, I would agree with you. May I just say one thing that's in that book? On the first night that I arrived, a man clearly of some standing around the compound, because he came in a phalanx, in the middle of a phalanx, and even the correctional officers stepped back from him, came over and welcomed me. And his opening gambit was, "Nobody will bother you here," which was reassuring. He seemed to speak with authority. And he said, "If you catch a cold, we'll find out who you got it from." And this guy was like a figure out of The Sopranos, and he had that accent, Anyway, he was the former Don of the Genovese family, and I have to say, he was a very courtly, intelligent and gracious man. I don't doubt he would be an utterly horrible man to have a dispute with, but he was a very nice man. And he made an arrangement. He was prosecuted twice seeking the death penalty, and there were mistrials. There were real problems getting convictions on people of his position, I think, where they're seeking a death sentence, and regardless of the facts. But he sent his lawyer to see the U.S. attorney, and they made a deal, which was that he would plead guilty to one count. He would take up to 6 years in a low or medium security place, and then he would never be prosecuted again, and he would never touch anything illegal again. But that if they went after him a third time, they were trying to kill him, and any creature in danger of its life can itself be dangerous. And his lawyer said, and my client can be very dangerous. Now, there is no doubt what they were saying, and the deal was accepted. But, and I'm not saying it was a bad deal, and I'm not whitewashing this guy's record. I suspect he did some things that we wouldn't approve of, but this is not justice, I mean, it's the justice of the jungle, where two great beasts agree to divide jurisdiction between them, but it's not justice.
So, in the book, you talk about the demise of your great love affair with America, and I wonder if you could just reflect on what could be done to rekindle that affair. You said you still love America but don't like it very much. I wonder if you could just expand on that a
Yeah.
little bit.
Well, here I think I can answer it and be less loquacious, which will be a relief to you. But look, it is a great country, and as I said to a group last night here in Calgary, the fact that it persecuted me half to death doesn't mean that it ceased to be a great country. Of course, it's a great country. And despite the fact that it has a rancid justice system, it is still an incomparably great country, and we all know that. And the world owes it a great deal, and in particular it owes it the triumph of democracy and the triumph of the free market. But that's not all it owes it. And those are incomparable achievements for a country, and they do not get washed away because of the tribulations and deteriorations in aspects of American society. I would have to be insane to be overloaded with affection for America as a country right now after the way I've spent the last decade. But I'd be like the famous person whose last words before being executed in the basement of the Lubyanka for offenses he did not commit, or "Long live Stalin." I mean, I'm not like that. The genius of renovation and of reform exists in that country, and it is, while it is in decline right now, it's not an irreversible decline, and it's not likely to be a continuous decline. But they really do have to, as they have from time to time in their history, address some terribly serious problems. And part of American optimism, which is a good thing in most respects, and again, something we can all learn from, is that it makes them terribly complacent at times. I mean, there are undoubtedly some Americans in the room, and everybody in the room knows a lot of Americans, and you know this at least as well as I do. I mean, it's a magnificent country, but it has this, it's somewhat narcissistic. It's so big, it's Americocentric, except for foreign policy specialists, it's not interested in any other country. It's not xenophobic. They don't dislike foreigners. They just aren't interested in them. And they have bought, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. They bought into this thing about American exceptionalism, and we do it differently, we do it better, and we don't need to learn anything from anyone. And American exceptionalism now is reduced exclusively to a matter of scale. There's no other country that operates on that scale. But that's all it is. They're not exceptionally good in any other respect. But yes, of course, it's a great country, and time heals most wounds. And my Republican friends tell me that when the administration changes, they'll get me invited back to the country. And no doubt I hope to live long enough that it recedes a long way in my thoughts, but it's still quite verdant in them right now.
You described the Americans as complacent. I always thought that Canadians had sort of an arm lock or headlock on complacency.
That's inhibition, not complacency.
Well, no. But the question is, you make some fairly brief comparisons between the American and Canadian judicial system. And if I would, to summarize them, I would say things are better here, but there are undertones of a slippery slope of decline in the Canadian system that we should be aware of. Am I reading too much in to pick up?
No, I think that's right. I have to say, Roger, I didn't actually conduct a rigorous
Well, these are fairly brief
analytical comparison, and so I don't want to pretend that I did or say anything too declarative, but I just make a couple of points. Our procedural rules are, I mean, I haven't had any criminal problems in this country, and I wouldn't have. I was just saying, passing, the chances of my committing a crime are less than zero, but that doesn't necessarily spare you from the onslaught of the system in the U.S. But we have relatively even procedural rules, and defendants have a serious chance, and they do win a lot of cases. And the defense speaks last to the jury, not as in the U.S. where the prosecutors speak last. And the jury can consult the transcript in Canada, which is not the case in the U.S. They have to rely on their memories. Now, we all have slips in our memories, but you can imagine the very ordinary group of people you get as jurors for a 4-month complicated commercial trial in areas of which they have no background personally, any of them, how well they would remember all this stuff. I mean, it's just you're throwing a dart at a board. And relatively few of the judges are ex-prosecutors, where most of the judges in the U.S. are. And there are none of these methods of depriving defendants of the right to defend themselves in Canada, which there are in the U.S. And so it is a better system. Now, there are signs under this government, led by people from this city who are friends of mine, and I think it's a good government in most respects, and I took it upon myself to urge my readers to re-elect it on 2 occasions. But I have misgivings, and I've written this, about the way they're going in custodial matters. I don't see them trying to tighten the prosecution rules, but their proposed reforms for the prison system are a mistake, in my opinion. I think prison is nonsense for nonviolent people. It's only done because it's always been done. It is a complete waste of money. It doesn't do any good. I mean, we managed to do some good for a few people because 2 friends of mine that I recruited as tutors and I helped all the people that were sent to us graduate from high school. We managed to do that. But they don't do anything for anybody. And prison is a debilitating experience unless you're a very well-anchored, strong person to begin with. And many people are, not just well-to-do, educated people like me, many people. But unless you are, you'll leave worse than when you started. And why do it? It's horribly expensive.
In a couple of weeks, you have a new book coming out on the flight of the Eagle, and very modest in scope. It looks at American strategic history from 1754 to 2013. So
it's not a small book.
It's not a small book. No, it's occupying most of the hard drive on my computer. Against that backdrop, how would you assess President Obama at this point? And is there still an opportunity for Obama to carve out a particular legacy, or is the time gone by the time you're in the second term? But how does he fit within this broad backdrop of American president?
I just want you to know it's an unambiguously pro-American book, and I am pro-American looking at the history of America. I'm not even anti-American now. I just don't have much affection for the country, but I'm respectful of it, as you've heard. And historically, I think it's been a magnificent country. And as I write in this book, the rise of America from a string of seaboard colonies in 200 years to a condition of preeminence in the world that no nationality has ever had is a story without the slightest parallel or precedent in the history of the world. It's an amazing story, and the point of the book is the chief reason for it is not just that half a continent, a very rich continent, was filled up with very motivated immigrants who were admitted in very large numbers. And it happened naturally, as if an organic thing. Of course, it wouldn't have happened without that, but the chief reason is that American statesmen at key times have acted with extreme intelligence and courage, and at times deviousness, but in good causes. And every president and every vice president and every secretary of state, everyone who's held all of those offices is mentioned in this book. The most of them are just mentioned for having held it. Not all of them actually did anything terribly germane to the history of the country. On President Obama, I do not think up to now he has been a successful president. Certainly, I think it's a great thing that they broke the color barrier. It's a wonderful thing the U.S. has a non-white president. Deserves credit for that. In straight political terms, his achievement in pulling Bill and Hillary Clinton's party right out from under them was an amazing achievement. I mean, Bill and Hillary are not amateurs. They're hardball pros, and it was their party, and he just took it away from them. And that was an astonishing thing. And the way he presented a sort of subliminal message, which I read as most of you Americans, being decent people, have a sense of guilt about what you've done to us. In Mr. Lincoln's phrase that I had occasion to quote last night, the 250 years of the bondsman's unrequited toil and the 100 years of segregation that came after it. You can rid yourself of that sense of guilt, and as a bonus, you never have to listen to charlatans like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton again if you vote for me. That's all you have to do. It was genius. He never put it quite like that, but everybody got it. But with that said, as president, when the day he was inaugurated, after 232 years of American independence, starting from the Declaration of Independence, the accumulated federal debt was $10 trillion, and now it's over $16 trillion. And there's no excuse for this, and it's terribly dangerous. I mean, I have no problem with deficit financing. I'm bug for Roosevelt, very admiring bug for Roosevelt, and I'm certainly an admirer of President Reagan. I mean, they ran deficits, but they reduced the deficits, and they were coming sharply down. Well, Roosevelt died before the war ended, but everything was in place to bring it down sharply, and it did. And in Reagan's case, the deficit was coming sharply down as a percentage of GDP and narrowing. But this president has given no indication of what he proposes to do. I mean, he set up the Simpson-Bowles Commission, but ignored it, and he's just sort of played a chicken game, and I don't think it's statesmanship. And in world affairs, he made purposeful remarks about Iranian nuclear weapons, but he's just waffled around. He doesn't lead. And the world is in a state of some confusion about where the U.S. defines its national security interests. And he's tried to revive arms control in a sense of disarmament. Well, any sane person knows that the nuclear powers aren't going to give up their weapons. And in this one sense, the Iranians are right. It's a fraud. I mean, it's just a club of people who have the weapons themselves and are lecturing moralistically to everyone else not to acquire them. And the Americans didn't do anything to prevent the Russians from acquiring them. And it was quite in order for the British to acquire them. And then they didn't try and dissuade de Gaulle from acquiring them for France. And if anyone tried to tell Mao Zedong he shouldn't acquire them, he ignored them. And then the Indians, and so on. But finally, we've got to a country where there really is a terrible reason to be concerned if they do get such weapons. And the U.S. has to lead because it's the world's most important country, and the absence of its leadership affects everybody, and he's not leading. Now, on your last point, yes, the president of the U.S. always deploys great potential power and great power to move opinion in his country and elsewhere. He's quite popular personally. He's certainly an intelligent man. So yes, he could still do lots of things. And I actually thought he was starting out not badly in his second term. But the last president who had a better second term than a first term was James Monroe, and that was a long time ago. Now, President Franklin Roosevelt had a terrific third term, but he's the only president who got to a third term.
So I have two questions left. One is to pull you back to an earlier part of your life and your scholarship on Quebec. And the reason that's of interest to me is that in this particular corner of the world, in this particular room, Quebec has sort of disappeared from the landscape. We have a rough idea somewhere. If you go to the front door and turn right, it's probably somewhere out there. But Quebec has sort of disappeared in terms of our thinking about the country. And yet, now we have Thomas Mulcair as a major presence. We have Justin Trudeau. We have a PQ in Quebec. Are Calgarians being particularly blind in this respect? Or has the world fundamentally changed in some way, and that we are maybe ahead of the game by trying to redefine the nature of the country?
I don't think the Calgarians are blind at all. I think what's happened is that it was the case that you really couldn't govern in Canada, couldn't form a government in Canada until comparatively recently without a reasonably strong representation from Quebec. And that has changed because of demographics and to a degree economics. And And secondly, the independentist threat in Quebec. Now, I know there were those in English Canada, not just in Calgary, but all over English Canada. There was no shortage of them in Toronto, who dismissed the idea of Quebec seceding and said, well, let them go, the hell with them, they're a bloody nuisance, they cost us a fortune, all these transfer payments, all they ever do is complain, they're a bunch of hypocrites and crooks anyway, and you can't understand or believe a word they say, so good riddance. Again, and somewhat of a caricature and a bit of hyperbole, but an understandable viewpoint. But the fact is, I don't think there's any serious danger of Quebec seceding. It is clear that they can't get anywhere near a majority without a trick question, and they can't put a trick question anymore. I was horrified at the time that Trudeau and Chrétien allowed them to get away with putting this question, on which all the rest of us were told the future of the country depended, which essentially was, do you authorize the government of Quebec to negotiate on your behalf an arrangement whereby the cake that is in front of you is consumed by us, gluttonously, consumed to the last crumb, but is miraculously replaced by an identical cake? Would you authorize us to negotiate that? And they still couldn't win that vote. And they can't do that anymore. And the fact is, tedious though it was, and goodness knows I understand the impatience of people, and I shared it myself and often wrote that. The whole process of negotiating, these first ministers' conferences where they would request the attention of the whole country for days on end and sing the national anthem at the end of it and pretend they'd actually made some progress. And they really hadn't, you know. But it was good faith negotiations, and it worked. It wore Quebec down, and it enabled this transfer payment system to addict the French Quebec nationalists to receiving money, much of it from this city and elsewhere in this province, and from British Columbia and Ontario, receiving this money so they could run an all-white collar economy. The percentage of Quebecers today, unlike 50 years ago, who are even factory workers, let alone lumberjacks or farmers or miners or something, is minuscule. They are all consultants or academics. They're completely useless in terms of value add. But they're happy and they're content and they're, you know, they disport themselves in their rimless glasses and speak a kind of imitative French that is, I may say, exceedingly amusing to real Frenchmen who hear it. And but they just can't cut it. They've made the deal. They will go through their pretense of a semi-autonomous state, and they've taken the addictive bribe, and they aren't threatening to break up the country. And I have to say that if they ever had voted to secede, I mean, a real vote to secede would have caused this whole country terrible problems. And Trudeau and other prime ministers, Mulroney and the rest, were right to go to great lengths to prevent it. And so, no, I think you're right to be much more relaxed about Quebec and to have a sense of your own increased importance. But I would hope that there's also been a relaxation of the old, that old redneck sentiment that you used to get, not only here, basically, well, they're just a bunch of frogs and the hell with them. I mean, they're all quite nice, most French Canadians. You know?
I'm just ruminating on your description of academics as useless, and then thinking...
No. I didn't say all academics, and I didn't mean that.
Thinking of my precarious state as a retired academic.
Yeah.
That's pretty well...
I'm sure your pension's safe, Roger.
So one last question before I throw it open. In this fall, you're starting a TV interview program on Vision TV. What prompted you to go that direction, and what should we be looking for in terms of this particular program?
Well, it's supposed to start in July, and the program is partly, it's mainly interviews. Yes, that's right, but also panel discussions a bit, you know. And what I mean, the idea is Moses and Eimers trying to revive this network and get it going. Now, there is a decision pending from the CRTC about whether the Vision Channel retains its access to the basic service, so people who take a basic cable service automatically get it. And exactly what kind of a budget he has at the end of it depends to some degree on that decision. What I think what they wanted me for was that, I mean, for one reason or another, I know a lot of people, and I you know, we, even for the pilot, we had some interviews with people who wouldn't be that accessible to Canadians phoning up asking for interviews, like Kissinger and Donald Trump and so on. And the assumption is that I can get these people on it because it's easy. You just Skype them. All they have to do is allow some guy into their office for 8 minutes at some point to answer soft and somewhat amusing questions, I hope, from me, and that's it, you know. So I think that it's not that anyone, including particularly myself, is under the impression that the great Canadian people are clamoring to see me on television, which wouldn't, unfortunately, be a novel experience for them anyway. But that was the idea. As to why I did it, Moses made me a very generous offer, not only, I mean, it's a half a day's work a week, you know. It's not, you know, it's not sort of nose to the grindstone stuff. And he made me a generous offer that included an equity participation in his business or option to do it. And so it was good. It was a good offer, and frankly, in doing it, it tends to reduce the curiosity that would otherwise have been there about what I'm doing.
It will be a shift to be the interviewer rather than the interviewee. So I
Yeah,
wish you
but
luck.
it won't be an interview thing in the way, say, you know, of aggressive interviews of people who are in the news that day. I'm not doing that. It would be people that I already know and see, you know, what do you know. My London correspondent is Barry Humphries, you know, Dame Edna, the Australian. So I mean, it's not like a sort of hardball interview. You know, Mr. X, what do you say to charges that you embezzled $50,000? You know, it's not like that.
I'll look forward to it. We have some time for questions from the floor. Please.
Somewhat analogous to your situation in talking about the comparative nature of the justice systems in Canada and the U.S., but moving to the less official system, can you provide your insights into the situation that's occurred in Canada with friends and colleagues such as Mark Stein with the Human Rights Commissions?
I thought that the pursuit of Mark Stein and Ezra Levin was absolutely scandalous and outrageous, and terribly upsetting to them as men, and severely destabilized their lives, and with, in a sense, justice was done, and the verdicts were all right, but justice was not done because these completely spurious proceedings took place at all. I mean, I am very much opposed, as I'm sure we all are, to excessive offense or gratuitous offense of the sensibilities of any group. But you know, we have to have freedom of expression. We have to give a bit of latitude in that area, or we're going to have people defining their sensibilities, which is in effect what happened, as any criticism. Well, I mean, have we got to the point where, and I suppose we have in some places, where it is really hazardous to your career and your well-being and your serenity and the serenity of your family and so on, to make certain comments about the proclivity of some types of militant Muslims, not all Muslims, but some types, to engage in terrorist activity? And of course that's the source of most terrorism in the world, and certainly most of it that affects the Western world. And I just think I don't doubt it out of a initially positive desire to avoid offending people and make sure that minorities aren't verbally or in public relations terms gratuitously mistreated. I don't doubt that the original intention was a good one, but it is out of control, and it is a menace to free speech. And you didn't ask me this, but I'll say, Tom Flanagan's here, and I don't know him well, but I know him, and he certainly would be the last person in this country to be soft on pedophilia or something like that. But he made a perfectly reasonable point, and my wife and I both wrote in defense of him in different publications, and the response I got was half favorable and half not. And Barbara didn't fare as well, but she, as usual, was a little more declarative than I am. And some of the responses we got were severely irrational. I mean, worrisome. They were so almost, I would say, psychotic in their allegations. And I would say this is worrisome. Let's all just, you know, as Dan Quayle said, pause and inhale, you know. And, let's not offend people unreasonably, but let's remember we all have the right to get things off our chests. And in Tom's case, to actually make a completely innocuous, accurate statement that there was no right whatsoever to take as an incitement to or expression of toleration of sociopathic activity.
The mic has a life of its own, and it's drifted off in this direction.
If I may,
Yes.
Conrad, I rise as an American, and I rise...
Where are you?
Over here.
Good, I'm sorry, yeah. No, I'm sorry, we've got the lights in our face here. Yeah, I see you now.
I rise as an American, I rise as a lawyer, I also rise as a person who's known you for over 30 years. The question I have, you've been a resident of Toronto, educated in Toronto and Quebec, heritage roots in Winnipeg, resident of the United States and experiencing a terrible situation down there, and a celebration in London. I don't see you as a Wolf Blitzer TV commentator. I ask you to take the background you've had, the intellect you've had, the research, the books that you've written, and ask you to reminisce out loud, where do you go with the rest of your life? You've experienced goods and bads over the last lifetime. Where would you like to go with the rest of your life?
I was never actually officially a resident of the U.S., though I owned 2 homes there. I was a British resident, and I'm a British citizen, and as was mentioned, a member of their parliament, and a Canadian citizen and a Canadian resident, and I'm a Canadian resident now. Look, they're all great countries, but you didn't really mean that geographically, I think. You were talking about
I've
in
been
the
to
career
your home
sense.
in Florida, but no. Where do you go next?
It's, for those of you who are interested in military strategy, it's like Liddell Hart's theory of the offense, and he likened it unto pouring water on top of the hillock. You know the water will go down the hill, but you can't tell exactly what paths it'll follow. So it goes where the resistance is least. So what I would like to do is, first of all, you'll appreciate that slugging it out with the U.S. government for a decade does not do wonders for your net worth. So, I mean, I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine, by most standards, a reasonably well-to-do person. But I'd like to relaunch my commercial activities, but not in public companies and not in a way that's publicized or focused upon. And I indeed have to some degree done that, and I'm doing that. As I said earlier, the one really, well, there have been a few good aspects of the last 10 years. I mean, some of the insights that I acquired, and even some of the relationships I developed when I was away, were very rewarding. But really the main positive development of all of that was that my career as a writer took off, both as a writer in a columnist and a writer of books. And the books I've written have been, if I may say, well received, and sold quite well, given they're nonfiction books on fairly heavy subjects. So I can do more of it, and I am doing more of it. And in fact, I'm already in keeping with my practice of the last few years of having a book already started when the previous one comes out, even though we're launching one this month in both this country and the U.S. I've already started my next one, which is a commissioned history of Canada, because I don't think Canadian history is written in an interesting way. And it is quite an interesting history if you write it properly. So that's what I'm working on. But that's a pastime when most of the rest of you are playing golf or tennis or going to the movies or something. That's what I'm doing, because I find it very relaxing and very interesting. So I try and, as I say, be prosperous and keep my hand in commercial matters, but not in the somewhat spectacular way that it was before for many years, and continue to write, not so much for periodicals as for books. And geographically divide between this country and the UK. And as I said, I assume that eventually I can, there's no doubt eventually if I wanted to go back to the US I could, and I probably would. I mean, it is a great and interesting country, but I'm happy to take a rest from it. I hope that I don't really have a compulsion to let everything out there to a group of strangers. It's a friendly question, it's a friendly group, but that school is slightly naturally reticent, but I hope that's an adequate answer.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Gibbins, Danielle Smith, Lord Black. I have a question along the lines of the comments that you'd made comparing the American and the Canadian judicial systems. I wouldn't mind your comments comparing the Security Exchange Commission enforcement process. Because as you know, in this country, we've been having a debate about whether or not we need to have a national regulator. One of the arguments made to me is, well, they need to have the same enforcement powers as the SEC. Well, I've watched what happened to yourself and to Martha Stewart at the same time as the Securities Exchange Commission was ignoring requests to investigate Bernie Madoff. So it seems like they've gone to one extreme. Meanwhile, here in Alberta, we have investors who've lost $2.5 billion on the collapse of things like concrete equities. We can't get anyone to muster any interest in a criminal investigation or pursuit of that. So there does seem to me to be one extreme versus the other. I wouldn't mind hearing your comments on the advantages and disadvantages, and maybe some suggestions for reform.
Will you tell me your name again?
So, Danielle Smith.
So you are indeed who I think you are.
I used to be an employee of yours. I was an editorial writer at the Calgary Herald in '99 when you owned the newspapers, but yes, I've moved on to politics.
Splendid. Well, look, I hope we can have a chance to shake hands before you leave. I want to tell you, I have great admiration for what you've done. I think it's a tremendous thing what Wild Rose has done, and I admire what you're doing, and I wish you I have some reservations myself about people who assume the leadership of what are called conservative parties and believe they can retain the conservative vote because that's the name of their party. Well, in fact, in policy terms, fishing farther to the left than they should. I won't go further than that. Yeah, look, I have to say I think the SEC is an absolutely abominable organization in almost every respect. And I'm happy to tell you all that, no, I guess I shouldn't read it, but I have reached a settlement with them, and it will have a happy ending for me. I won't go further than that. Apart from anything else, the U.S. government and all its manifestations is a sensitive ego, so I won't push things. But it, as you know, it was set up in 1934, but 35 by President Roosevelt, really as a sop to sentiment that chicanery in the securities industry had been a large contributor to the stock market crash and the depression. And the early chairman of the SEC and the commissioners, even Joseph Kennedy, whose appointment as the first chairman, the president explained in the phrase, "set a thief to catch a thief." Commendable sense of candor. Were not trying to harass business. They were just trying to make sure that really outrageous things didn't happen. And the SEC recently has, I think, been engaged in just endless pettifogging and harassment of people in commerce. And to the extent they've failed to convict people, it's because the laws haven't been modified to make convictions virtually automatic the way they are in many criminal areas in the U.S. And you're absolutely right. They overlook all manner of terrible skullduggery. Not only an egregious case like Madoff, where I mean, it's one thing to embezzle $10 million or whatever the amount is from a large bank, where it's a terrible thing to do, but it's a tax deduction and they massage it around and they have reserves anyway and they've got millions of shareholders and nobody really suffers very much personally. But to take the money of friends and of charities, all of it, I mean the life savings of friends and the complete assets of bona fide charities and squander them in that way on the basis of an ongoing fraud of many years is really a shocking thing to do. But and they had plenty of notes. You're absolutely right. And it's notorious that they were warned again and again that there was something that didn't ring right about this man, and they didn't do anything. But you know, I have to say that I think they should start by changing the rules that govern the major merchant banks. I mean, this gathering I was at last night, their subject came up of Goldman Sachs, amongst many others, all of them really, issuing tens of billions, scores of billions of dollars of these real estate-backed securities that any serious financier had to know were worthless or were apt to become worthless at a moment's notice. And at the same time, although I accept that the senior management of Goldman Sachs didn't know it, short selling them at the back door for their own house accounts, betting against their own clients to whom they'd sold these things, relying on a guarantee from the rating agencies that they knew to be spurious, that they were investment quality. Well, I think if the SEC was reoriented, and in an odd way, though, Mary Jo White was a terribly aggressive prosecutor when she was U.S. Attorney in New York City. She has been averse to just the indiscriminate prosecution of business people, which the Attorney General Holder seems to favor. And I think that they may be trying to reorient the SEC to focusing on real wrongdoers and not just the general harassment of the business community, which is what the SEC does much of the time. But there is an absolutely inordinate amount of ludicrous formality and hectoring and pettifogging for the most minor things. We're just, I'm not directly personally involved, but I am as an investor with assisting a company out of a somewhat straitened financial condition and bringing all its filings up to date and everything. The SEC is being, I mean, we've got it all done, it's fine now, but they put us to a completely unnecessary amount of trouble. Now, I was opposed, to make the comparison, I don't think the OS sees any prize either. I don't think they're as bad as that. They're not as quick to prosecute people. But I am opposed to a single regulator for Canada. And I think, frankly, what you people should do here is build up your own securities commission and sell it, and you'd be astounded at the stampede of people you get listing from all over the world, serious companies. If you have it in the hands of people who are business friendly but crime hostile, if I may say, who are absolutely unforgiving and strenuous on fraud and fraudulent reporting, or evasion. But in all other respects, make it as simple as they can for the honest businessmen, which is 98% of them. And there's a huge opportunity for Alberta. And Ms. Smith, if you're the Premier, I imagine you'll do it. Again, I wish you well.
Well, thank you. As Greg makes his way up to the stage to draw the event to a close, I just wanted to mention that I'm delighted there's another book in the works. Retired academics always ask one another, what's the next book? We ask that of people who have not even written the first book, but we assume that when they're 75, there's a next book that's just waiting to come. So I'm delighted in this case that there is a next book and look forward to it. So thank you very much, and Greg.